How did lines drawn on a map by European powers over a century ago lead to some of the most persistent conflicts in Africa today? The arbitrary borders established by colonial rulers, particularly during the infamous Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, have left a lasting legacy on the continent. These borders were imposed without regard for Africa's complex ethnic, cultural, and linguistic diversity, leading to deep-rooted political tensions and conflicts that continue to shape the continent's reality. The creation of Africa's modern borders dates back to the 19th century when European powers competed to control vast territories in Africa during the Scramble for Africa. At the Berlin Conference in 1884 to 1885, European nations, without consulting African leaders or considering local populations, drew boundaries on maps that divided Africa into colonies. These borders were arbitrary, cutting through communities, ethnic groups, and even traditional kingdoms. The primary focus of European powers was economic gain and geopolitical dominance, rather than the social or political stability of African territories. As a result, these borders set the stage for political instability and conflict long after independence was achieved by African nations. Colonial borders often divided ethnic groups, forcing people with different languages, customs, and historical enmities to coexist within the same nation. For example, Nigeria is home to over 250 ethnic groups, with the three largest, Hausa, Yoruba, and Igbo, being in constant tension due to differing cultural and political interests. Similarly, Rwanda's colonial history exacerbated the divide between the Hutu and Tutsi ethnic groups, which culminated in the horrific 1994 genocide. These ethnic tensions, artificially created or worsened by colonial borders, have been a significant source of political and social conflict in Africa. Even today, ethnic fragmentation remains a key factor in civil unrest and challenges to nation building across the continent. Upon gaining independence, African nations were left with the difficult task of nation building within the confines of colonial borders. Many new states had to unite people from different ethnic, linguistic, and religious backgrounds under a single national identity. This was no easy task, as many of these groups held long-standing rivalries. The political structures and institutions introduced by colonial powers were often weak or inappropriate for fostering unity. In places like Congo, where over 200 ethnic groups exist, the lack of national cohesion has made governance fragile, resulting in repeated cycles of political instability. Colonial borders, designed to benefit European powers, continue to challenge the ability of African states to form strong, unified nations. Colonial borders also had an economic dimension, dividing resource-rich regions from those with fewer natural assets. In some cases, this has exacerbated regional economic disparities within African nations. For example, Nigeria's Niger Delta region is rich in oil, yet it suffers from economic underdevelopment and environmental degradation due to exploitation by multinational corporations. The unequal distribution of wealth and resources, which often follows colonial-era boundaries, has been a source of political tension and conflict in many African countries. In regions where resources are concentrated in one area, such as oil in Angola or diamonds in Sierra Leone, local populations often feel marginalized, leading to uprisings and violence. Unresolved border disputes left over from colonial times continue to be a source of political tension across Africa. For instance, the conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea over their shared border has resulted in decades of hostilities and war, with thousands of lives lost. Similarly, the Western Sahara conflict involves Morocco and the Sahrawi people, who have sought independence since the colonial withdrawal of Spain in 1975. Colonial powers, in many cases, failed to clearly define territorial boundaries, leading to ongoing disputes over territory. These conflicts, although rooted in historical events, have contemporary consequences, fueling political instability and disrupting development efforts across the continent. The fragmentation of political systems due to colonial borders has significantly contributed to political instability in Africa. Weak governance structures inherited from colonial administrations often left newly independent states vulnerable to power struggles. Ethnic divisions often aligned with geographical regions have fueled frequent military coups and regime changes. For example, Mali, which has experienced multiple coups in recent years, continues to struggle with balancing power among its ethnic groups. In Sudan, decades of conflict between the North and South eventually led to the secession of South Sudan in 2011. Colonial borders have, in many cases, exacerbated political fragility as leaders struggle to maintain control over diverse populations with competing interests. The civil wars that have plagued Africa since independence can often be traced back to colonial-era borders. The Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, one of the largest countries in Africa, has faced continuous conflict since its independence from Belgium. The DRC's vast size, ethnic diversity, and rich mineral resources coupled with poorly drawn borders have made it a hotspot for civil wars and foreign interventions. Similarly, the Sudanese Civil War, which resulted in the eventual independence of South Sudan, was fueled by regional, ethnic, and economic divisions. Artificially imposed borders have made it difficult for governments to maintain control, leading to prolonged and bloody conflicts in many parts of the continent. The weak and porous nature of colonial borders has also allowed for the rise of cross-border terrorism and insurgency movements. Groups like Boko Haram operating in Nigeria, Chad, and Niger exploit the inability of governments to effectively control their borders. Similarly, Al-Shabaab operates across Somalia and Kenya, taking advantage of the instability in border regions. These terrorist organizations thrive in areas where state control is weak, often using borders as safe havens from government military efforts. The legacy of poorly drawn and insecure colonial borders has thus not only caused internal conflicts, but also contributed to the rise of regional and international security threats. International organizations such as the African Union, AU, and the United Nations, UN, have played critical roles in mediating and resolving border disputes in Africa. The peace agreement between Ethiopia and Eritrea, brokered by the UN in 2018, is an example of how international efforts can help resolve long-standing territorial disputes. The African Union's principle of respecting colonial borders, the UTI Possidetis principle, has been critical in preventing further redrawing of boundaries, which could potentially cause more conflicts. However, while these organizations have helped in some cases, the deep-rooted nature of these conflicts often requires long-term and locally driven solutions to achieve lasting peace. Colonial borders have also been a major cause of refugee crises in Africa. Conflicts over territory, ethnic tensions, and civil wars have led to mass displacements of people. For example, the conflict between Sudan and South Sudan, along with the internal instability in both countries, has generated millions of refugees. Similarly, ongoing conflicts in the DRC and the Central African Republic have displaced millions, forcing them to flee to neighboring countries. These refugee crises put a strain on neighboring states and contribute to regional instability. The issue of forced migration due to colonial borders highlights the long-term human cost of these artificially drawn boundaries. In response to the challenges posed by colonial borders, African nations have made efforts to promote regional integration and cooperation. Organizations like the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, and the African Union's Agenda 2063 aim to foster economic and political cooperation across the continent. These initiatives are designed to overcome the divisive effects of colonial borders by promoting cross-border trade, peace, and security. While progress has been made in some areas, achieving full integration remains challenging due to the entrenched political, economic, and social divisions that still exist along colonial lines. The socio-economic development of African nations continues to be shaped by colonial borders. Regions near borders are often marginalized and underdeveloped, with limited access to infrastructure, healthcare, and education. For example, border regions in countries like Ethiopia and Kenya are economically disadvantaged compared to central areas. Additionally, the resource distribution that colonial powers favored has led to significant disparities in development within African nations. Many border regions suffer from economic neglect and are often the first areas to experience instability and conflict. Over overcoming the legacy of colonial borders in socio-economic development is critical for fostering long-term peace and prosperity across Africa. The legacy of colonialism, particularly the arbitrary borders drawn by European powers, continues to shape modern Africa in profound ways. From ethnic fragmentation to ongoing border disputes, the effects of colonial borders are deeply embedded in the political and social fabric of the continent. While efforts toward regional cooperation and conflict resolution have shown promise, the path to overcoming these historical injustices remains long and complex. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more content like this.